keep in touch after this.
All right, so cool.
Okay, I think it's 7:04, close enough. So welcome everyone. Thanks for being here for our summer cabin. And our guest tonight is Adrian Miller. And Adrian, I'm going to give you some background. Adrian is a local guy, done well. He graduated from Smoky Hill High School in Aurora, went to Stanford, went to law school at Georgetown. He worked in the White House in the Clinton administration. He served as a special assistant to President Clinton with his Initiative for One America, the first freestanding office in the White House to address issues of racial, religious, and ethnic reconciliation. Now, this is just a rumor, but Adrian told me this years ago. It's a rumor that one of the characters on the TV show The West Wing was actually modeled after him. I don't know if that's true, but that's a good rumor. Back in Colorado, Adrian served as a senior policy analyst for Governor Bill Ritter. Adrian is currently the executive director of the Colorado Council of Churches and is the first African-American and the first layperson to hold the position. So if you're tempted to call him father or pastor or reverend or most reverend, you can, but you don't have to. Adrian's written 2 books, Soul Food, The Surprising Story of American Cuisine, One Plate at a Time, and his other book, The President's Kitchen Cabinet, the story of African Americans who have fed our first families, from the Washingtons to the Obamas. Both of those books won very prestigious awards for nonfiction, including the James Beard Award. Adrian's next book is almost ready. It's a history of African American barbecue. Is it still going to keep the title Black Smoke?
Absolutely.
Cool. Very cool. He's traveled extensively throughout the United States. He's also done some work in Europe, giving lectures about food, African American chefs at the White House, and the intersection of theology and food. He's been written about, he's written a bunch of stuff, he's been interviewed in the press, he's done a bunch of podcast interviews. Now, he does have some Lutheran credentials, which is zero importance to our congregation, but that's okay. Last year, he received an award from Wartburg College in Iowa, which is an ELCA school, for being an outstanding layperson whose life is nurtured and guided by a strong sense of Christian calling and who is making a significant contribution to community, church, and our society. Now, Adrian and I are friends. I can't remember the exact year I met him. It's been at least 2 decades as we run a lot of the same circles. If you have any civic involvement in Colorado, eventually you're going to run across Adrian Miller. Now, most of you know that I was a University of Colorado regent. I ran for re-election in 2012, and Adrian, clearly having some desire for penance for some sin that he doesn't know about, agreed to my campaign manager. We traveled to all 64 counties in Colorado in 10 days. And the fact that he didn't murder me, which would have been justifiable homicide, shows you that he's a saint. During the trip, though, one of the interesting things is related to this topic. We discovered that most Colorado mountain towns actually have a barbecue place. And most of them, Adrian told me, are not very good. And that's when I learned that Adrian is a certified barbecue judge. Some lesser known facts about Adrian. He has his own Wikipedia page, super jealous about that. He loves to take pictures of his food. That's not new behavior. He's been doing it forever. In the summer, he drives a 1965 Ford Mustang, hardtop, it's red. He uses whack properly in a sentence, and he drops knowledge like hot biscuits. Please welcome the soul food scholar, Adrian Miller. Oh, and
that was a great introduction.
Thank you. He's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a dialogue with him after that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Steve. That is a great intro. I really appreciate it. And thanks for the opportunity to be with you all today. So first let me tell you about the Colorado Council of Churches, if you've never heard of it. It's a collaboration of 13 Christian denominations representing 800 churches across the state of Colorado. And most of our churches are the mainline Protestant denominations. So ELCA, is part of us, one of our denominations, and Methodist, Episcopal Church, most of the mainline denominations. And so basically we come together to get to know each other beyond our denominational silos. And then the idea is that we build on those relationships to do social justice work on a number of things: criminal justice reform, homelessness, affordable housing, healthcare, immigration, all kinds of issues. But if you've never heard of the Colorado Council of Churches, we're the ones who do the Easter sunrise service at Red Rocks every year. So we've been doing that for 73 years, except when it snows. But even this year with the pandemic, we did it virtually, so that was cool. So what I'd like to do today is I would love to give you my experiences, just talk a little bit about what it's like to be an African American in this moment, and then really tell you about my lessons learned and frustrations and joys with doing racial justice work in Christian denominations. And then just really talk to you all about where do we go from here. So first of all, I often think about three things. One, I think about my 80-year-old father who grew up in rural Arkansas at a time where if you were an African American, if you looked a white person in the eye, you were risking death, because that was against racial etiquette of the time. So this is within, this is my father. Um, and so after George Floyd was murdered, I just asked my dad, given all his experience, what he has lived through, I just said, "Hey, Dad, where do you think this is going?" And he said, after this 1960s civil rights movement, all of the laws that were passed, I just never thought we would be at this point. So that just shows you the dreams of an 80-year-old man, African American man in this country, dashed. Secondly, when I think about George Floyd, I know that, but for the grace of God, that could have been me. Now, I have been very lucky compared to my African American friends, especially men I know, because I've never had a gun cocked at my head wrongly. And that's happened to more of my friends than you would want to believe. But I have been harassed by the cops, but it's never gotten to a point where I ever feel fear for my life. I just knew that my rights were being violated. But being Black in this country means that we know that anything, any situation can go horribly wrong in a very short period of time. And then the last thing I think about is I just think about the words of Gianna Floyd, George Floyd's daughter, and she said, "My daddy changed the world." And so my question for all of us is, can we really bring those words to fruition? I was talking to Pastor Reese earlier. Typically, when these things happen, there's tremendous energy in the moment, and then it dissipates within a few months. And I'll have to tell you, I really thought that we would be in this place 5 years ago when that young white man walked into that church in Charleston, South Carolina, and murdered that Bible study group. I am part of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. That's my faith tradition. So that hit me hard, because I know if he had walked into my Bible study here in Denver, we would have done the same thing. We would have welcomed him, treated him like a brother. But, it just didn't happen. And I'm not sure why it didn't happen. But this moment feels different. And I think for two reasons. One, I think there was a lot of pent-up energy because of the COVID pandemic. People were cooped up in their homes for a couple of months. So when there was a spark there, I think there was a lot of energy to do something. But I think the most significant factor is that video. Often when I tell white people about the things that Black people have suffered throughout history, or even myself, I get the sense that they're discounting it. They may kind of believe me, but they think because it's so beyond their own experience, they just kind of say, "Oh, well, whatever." And then whenever there's an interaction with police, there's usually some excuse made. "Oh, that person was resisting arrest. Oh, that person was in the wrong," or whatever. But what happened with George Floyd, it was undeniable, the inhumanity that was asserted on him. And to see him calling for his mother, I think that just moved people in a way that it hasn't before. And so I'll give you an example of why I think this is a different moment. One is I have a friend who's a young white woman. She's got kids. After George Floyd was killed, she just went on Facebook and said, "You know what? I'm really disturbed by what's happening here. I'm going to be in this park on Sunday. If you're a mother, white mother, please come out and join me and let's talk about this." She had 40 plus people show up, and she chronicled what they discussed and she put it on Facebook. I've never seen that happen before. I've been doing this work with the Council of Churches for a long time, and I have more white churches now approaching me saying that they want to build a sister relationship with the Black church. And they're coming to grips with the racism within their pews. Just a couple of days ago, a pastor that I've been trying to get involved with the council for years, who's kind of rebuffed me, just called me out of the blue, and he said, "The stuff that people are saying in my congregation has really opened my eyes. I had no idea about the racism of the people in the pews. And these are people I've pastored for years, and I feel like I have failed." That's just never happened before. So let me talk about the racial work that I've done in the Council of Churches. So going back to that moment before with the church in Charleston. So on my own, I'd already been thinking about having basically a black and white church potluck dinner because, I'm into food. So I just figured that food is a great way to bring people together. So the idea was after church on a Sunday, the host church, which was Park Hill United Methodist Church, big church, great big dining hall. So it would seem like a great space. We would just invited people to come and bring food from their tradition and then just sit down at a table with someone you don't know and just talk. And then after that meal, after you've talked a little while, if there's some way that your churches can work together, we would figure out how to do that. I knew, and I was going to leave it up to the natural kind of the organic process of partnering with the church and let them sort out what they were going to do. Because I knew that if I said, the Council of Churches would like you to do this, nobody was going to do that. Before that event, I tried to get black and white churches ahead of time to partner so that we could announce, hey, we've got X number of churches already ready to go. Hopefully you all here can build on that. And this is what I heard. The black pastors were very cynical about the white church. They told me, they said, look, Adrian, these white Christians, they don't want to do the hard work of racial justice and reconciliation. They just want us to show up on Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, preach a little sermon so they can check off a box. And I said, no, I think we're in a different place because of what happened in Charleston, the awareness of Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner. I mean, the list goes on. So sure enough, we had a few churches pair up. We had a great event. 200 people showed up for that event. I mean, outside of the Easter sunrise service, it's the best event that, in my tenure at least, of the Colorado Council of Churches. And it was interesting. People brought a lot of interesting food. We even had some vegan soul food. And if you know what vegan is and what soul food is, that seems like an oxymoron. When confronted with that plate of vegan soul food, I did say, forgive them, Lord, for they know not what they do. But actually, you know what? It was good stuff. It was good food. So afterwards, I checked in with some of the partnerships that had merged. And sure enough, I talked to one white pastor, and she said, we've done a few things with this black church, but my congregants are asking me, why do we keep doing stuff with that church? So it played right into what the black pastors were saying. Let me give you a couple of other anecdotes. Whenever I have a newsletter at the Council of Churches, and whenever I send out anything that expressly talks about racial justice, I will always get unsubscribes. And the unsubscribes surprised me for two reasons. First, I was like, wow, people read my newsletters? That was the first surprise. But the second surprise is like, okay, we're Christians. We're supposed to be loving. Why do people not even want to hear about racial justice? Another data point. A few years ago, we had a ballot initiative to take the words involuntary servitude out of our state constitution. There's an exception that you can, basically enslave people for debt. And so one church, big white church, had a informational session that just said, hey, we're just going to tell you about Amendment A. We're not taking a position. We just want you to understand what it is, why it's on the ballot, that sort of thing. After this informational session, someone who was very wealthy, donor of that church, came up to the organizers afterwards on the verge of tears and said, don't make me leave my church. She didn't even want to hear information about that. And the third data point I'll just leave with you is I have pastors who have told me that when they say Black Lives Matter from the pulpit, and this is in Colorado, people get up and leave mid-sermon. Now think about that. So, we have a lot of challenges here. So a lot of my work and what I've been thinking about is what I call setting a welcome table. And that's the name of this. So the idea is like, how do we create a space where people feel welcome and that they can come and say what's on their mind, but also listen. And if someone says something with which we disagree, to hold that tension, to love that person as a human being and just understand you disagree, but that because you love that person as a human being, you will endeavor to continue to understand and try to get to a place where we have a shared future. So I have created spaces for people through church events. And, it's pretty much you get people that are already there. Now, don't get me wrong. There's always a benefit to fellowship. There's always a reason to come together. But what I've noticed is the people who either don't think about race that often or don't want to think about race don't come in those spaces. And that's where I think the real breakthrough is going to happen, because my own feeling is that the real breakthrough is going to happen when white people talk to other white people about race. And when somebody who's a peer or somebody you respect starts talking about race, I think that connects in a different level. Because when I myself had talked to other people about race, I think what I say gets kind of discounted in a way. And not outright dismissed, but just discounted in a way. And it doesn't land maybe the way that I would like it to. So, the challenge for us, who are all of us who are people of goodwill, is how do we create welcome tables in our lives? What does that look like? How can we do it? I am actually trying to work through a curriculum through food, where basically it would be a 4-part series where the first part would be a potluck. And it's just like getting to know each other and then talk about what a possible dialogue might look like. The second piece of that would be the marginalized community. So I'm trying not to make this race specific. I think you could have a welcome table approach to any difficult subject, but whoever is the marginalized community, for lack of a better word, would then lead the second part of that discussion. And then the third part would be everyone else talking about reacting to what the marginalized community said. And then the fourth part is to then start to think about, well, how can we continue this dialogue, or maybe even come up with solutions? So it's packaged as a 4-part series, because I just understand human psychology. I know if you tell people, hey, we're going to have an ongoing race dialogue until we sort this out, very few people are going to come. But if they know that it's discreet and they only have to put a certain amount of energy into it, I think you have a chance to bring people into that space. And the reason why I think about food is you could have that potluck for the first meal, but then the second and third and fourth meals could actually be assigning people a food item that is shared among the cultures of the people participating in that dialogue. So those of you who know about food, a lot of cultures have a dumpling. A lot of cultures have some kind of wrapped food. There's a lot of things you can play with. There's certain drinks. So I'm still working that out, but that's kind of the direction I'm headed. I would love to get your thoughts on if you think that's a sound approach. But I think we have a lot of work to do. And if you had a chance to read that article that was sent out, we have some deep problems in the Christian church. And white supremacy is really rampant in the Christian church. More so, the fact that we tend to be in our, Christian denominations, we tend to be more racist than people who aren't religious, I think is alarming, because it should be the exact opposite. And I believe that because of our faith tradition, Jesus would not have wanted that. I know that there are people that don't believe that the church should have politics involved. In a sense, they want a bubble. They want to leave the world outside and have a pure, unadulterated worship experience. But the dude we profess to follow, he would have been talking about all that stuff that's happening in the world right now. One of my favorite Bibles is called the Poverty and Justice Bible. And in that Bible, they highlight every reference to social justice in orange. And when you flip through that Bible, most of it is orange. That's our calling. That's our tradition. That's our prophetic witness. And I think we are, and I'm saying we collectively, because it's not your church, as Steve admonished me earlier. We're talking about other people. But look, this is our prophetic calling, right? And it seems like we're more interested in worshiping a God of tranquility than a God who's calling for us to love people, to be repairers of the breach, to answer the cries for justice in this world. And I truly believe that we, as people of faith, if we can work this out, we can model how to do this to other people. Because there are very few spaces left in our society where we come together. And the church is one of them, where people of all different walks of life come together in one space. The church is one of the few left. And I think in many ways we're missing opportunities. Now, I can tell you this: a lot of times pastors don't want to do this work because they don't want to divide their congregation, because they believe if they take a stance on something, people are going to leave. And that's thinking in terms of scarcity and rather than abundance. But I can tell you this: my experience, especially talking to young people, is one of the reasons they're not engaged in our churches is because they see that we're not speaking to the larger issues in the world. And so rather than go to church, they're just forming meetup groups and other things to meet the moment, right? They don't see church and they don't see Christians as those meeting the moment. And it's not completely true, right? There are plenty of Christians who are out there active in the world, trying to make the world a better place. But often we're doing it in a direct service model instead of thinking of it as a justice model. We meet the needs of people as they arise, but not frequently do we get out in the world and address the systems that are creating the problems that we meet through our food banks, through our charities and other things. And I've been calling on people to address those systems, but there's this belief of a separation of church and state, which is misinterpreted because people are thinking that means that we can't do politics. Churches can get involved in political stuff. It's just you can't endorse candidates. But you can get involved in ballot initiatives. You can make statements and policy statements and say, hey, that's not right. That needs to change. We can do those things. So it's going to take some energy. It's going to take some goodwill. But what do the scriptures tell us? God did not give us a spirit of fear, right? But of power and a sound mind. So we have it within us. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be messy. Mistakes are going to be made. But here's another moment I think Christians can teach the world is how to forgive. Because we're dealing with 400 years plus of oppression and injustice. And it's not going to change on a dime, right? It's going to take a lot of work to get through this. But I think we can do it. So let me just stop there. And I would love to engage in some dialogue. And let me just say this. In my effort to create this as a welcoming space, I'm just going to assume that you're a person of goodwill. So don't be scared of saying something that you think is going to be interpreted as racist. Whatever you have to say in the dialogue, you don't have to spend 5 minutes qualifying what you're going to say. I just assume you're a person of goodwill. So let's just get the questions out there and let's talk it out. Thank you for the time.
Got a question, just jump on in.
I'll jump in. Hi, my name is Aram. Thank you, Adrian.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Thanks. I'm part of the group. It's called the Housekeepers, and we're kind of sort of the leadership group of the church. And we've been going through Austin Channing Brown's book, I'm Still Here. And the last meeting we had when we were discussing this was really fruitful discussion. And I'll try to make this brief. One of the things that came up was,
sorry, Aaron, someone's typing.
Someone's typing?
Yeah, I'm hearing something come through. Is it just me?
No, somebody is typing.
Okay.
It sounds like.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things we talked about was, like at House for All Sinners and Saints, when I look at, we talked about how we do a really good job with inclusivity when it comes to LGBTG. I always get the letters mixed up. LGBTQ. And I look at my journey, and maybe like a dozen years ago or 15 years ago, I had hardly any friends. And then my sister came out, and then this happened and this happened. And then I started attending House, where, half the church is gay or trans. And now my life is flooded with gay, trans friends. I mean, it's not an issue. I don't even think of it. It's just, they're my friends. Mm-hmm. Then I ask myself, how many black friends do I have? Goose egg, 0. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so we're just talking through how we change that without making it like a project, or making it, you hear the word performative. How do we make that? I feel bereft because I'm lacking in that, and my world can be enriched. Not to speak selfishly, but it's true. And so, yeah, I guess that's my question: is how do we do this? How do we start moving into this without sort of coming across as performative? Or I think you get my drift.
Yeah, so that's why I really am interested. Thank you for that. That's why I'm really interested in this idea of kind of church partnerships, like almost sister church relationships. And I think they would probably work best with a congregation that's roughly about the same demographics in terms of size, age, that kind of thing. But I just think the act of maybe building a relationship with the church could facilitate that. Otherwise, I just think it's just too tricky, because I got to tell you, a lot of African American friends I have, they're tired, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're like, why do I got to keep doing this?
Right.
So,
right.
I think on an individual level, it just may be really difficult. But I think I think communities, congregations could do that if you have good leadership that can push things along. I think that those are the best prospects. That's just my own feeling. Now, having said that, as I said earlier, it hasn't been so easy to get that, because there's cynicism on one side of the equation and fear or not a sense of what to do on the other side of the equation. And that has led to paralysis, I think, in forming these relationships. That's why I thought the Council of Churches as an umbrella organization could be the energy and help be the glue for that. But even with that, it was still hard to do. But I'm just not going to give up. And I think that this moment has presented an opportunity to give it another try.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, I'm super excited by this idea of community shared sort of sister congregations rooted in food, in potluck, because our congregation is a very like food conscious congregation, and we when we meet in person, we have a meal every other week basically after church, and it's either potluck or a group of volunteers cooks for the whole church, and I could see that really working.
Nice.
But I had a question specifically about soul food. So, I'm from the South. I grew up in Memphis. I grew up almost exclusively eating soul food. But we didn't call it soul food. It was just Southern food.
Dinner.
And yeah, it was just dinner, it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized, hey, this stuff that people are calling soul food, it's what we ate. And yet there was such I grew up in Memphis, Southern Baptist. Most of my relatives were working class in the country, like kind of quintessential racism. I grew up around all that. And recently I just had this thought, like, what if white people could be taught that, like, you can't eat collard greens, you can't eat fried chicken without caring about the people that help make this possible? Like really connecting the cuisine to justice.
Yeah. No, I think there's an opportunity for that, because I think in this foodie moment, there's I think more and more people want to know the backstory of different foods. And to your point, I just don't think people understand the background of collard greens and fried chicken and all of these dishes, as well as other dishes. And so, part of this element of the welcome table I'm thinking about is some component that gives a little bit of nugget of the backstory so that people connect to it. And they can say, oh, that culture did it this way. Okay, this is how we do it. Or, oh, you guys like fried chicken too? This is how we did it in my culture. And find those commonalities. Because I think that spurs conversation and then relationship. So I'm with you on that. And, I just happen to be this guy that wrote a book about the history of soul foods. So maybe I could give that backstory, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm excited about this. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. But, so here's the question, though. Is that enough to get somebody in the room to come into that space.
Right.
I just don't know. Yeah.
Leslie, you unmuted. Did you have a question?
Oh, you weren't supposed to see that, Stephen. I wasn't sure if I had a question. I just wanted to be ready just in case. But since you called me out, I would love to thank you, Adrian, for just being here and say hello to everybody from house, because I'm just very, very excited. And also, one of the things that you said, Adrian, really struck me, that the white churches were, or white people go to church for the message and to leave. But as you were saying that, I was thinking that all of the work of social justice happens in Black churches. So, I mean, that seemed like a wider chasm as you were saying that. And so I'm interested to see how we do come together.
Yeah, and I think it's a matter of culture, right? It's a deep-rooted culture, because the Black church exists because of white racism in the church, right? We wanted to worship with whites, but we were either given a segregated experience, or we were just told, "Oh, just obey your masters." It was a very, very condensed version of the gospel that did not have to do anything about love. So, we're dealing with the culture. So I think because of that separation from 300 years ago, the Black church has been about social justice. So, one interesting question, I'm just going to throw this out, you didn't ask this, is I love the Black worship style. So I don't know if I want to be reunited with the white church. I don't know if that makes me racist, but but I think there's room for us to grow together, be in relationship, and learn from each other. But yeah, like you said, it's just some deep cultural differences. Like, it's just hard to think of going to a Black church without talking about social justice.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just weird. But I'm telling you, just after being in so many white churches, listening to sermons and stuff, I just don't hear social justice preached that often. And I do wonder, after these things happen in our society, I know every Black church is going to be talking about that, but I don't know how much it's preached about in the white church. In fact, I went on Twitter after George Floyd was killed, and I just put it out there. I just said, so was there any mention of George Floyd at all this past Sunday? And if not, you should ask your pastor why. And I have to say, though, more white people responded, yes, we talked about it, than I expected, but it wasn't a whole lot of people.
Ben, did you have something?
Yeah, I kind of had a question to piggyback off of Aram's question. So I've spent a lot more time sort of in the Texas church circles and Baptists, yada yada. But so I'll frame my question with this. I have a cousin who was a minister up in Seattle, really felt a calling to come back to Houston, where he was from. And he said he had it like in Honky Tonk in Fort Worth, and he just felt like he had this calling to come back and do racial reconciliation work amongst the suburbs. But then when he got here, we were having conversation, in a conversation just about the LGBTQ community. And so my question for you, having seen the lay of the land and been in the middle of it in Denver, how would you say the Black church in Colorado is sort of dealing with the journey to becoming open and affirming, and getting involved in pride and sort of reconciling that part of our American Christianity?
Yeah, not a very good job at all. Homophobia is deep in the Black church. So those of us who want to be affirming and reconciling, we have our work to do on that. And I'm glad you brought that up, because we're talking about homophobia right now, but it was really my thinking on race deepened when I started to think about patriarchy and sexism. And it was the light bulb moment that someone had to turn the light bulb on for me. Basically, a friend of mine, we were talking, and she was telling me how every night after work, when she goes home, she physically checks every room in her apartment before she feels secure. And I was thinking, man, I just come home and sit on the couch and turn on SportsCenter and I feel secure. So I thought, hey, look, I think I'm a good guy. And I've never even thought about what a woman goes through. Does that mean I'm bad? And by transferring that and applying it to race, I was like, okay, in this society, I can see that there are a lot of situations where white people don't have to think about race. So if they don't have to think about race, are they a bad person because they haven't thought about it? And that helped me a lot on these issues. And so the same thing has to happen with homophobia, man. The Black church is way behind. We've got a few congregations here and there that have taken those steps. But, you know, my faith tradition, African Methodist Episcopal Church, our official doctrine says marriage is a man and a woman, you know, but we have gay pastors who are open. So, you know, the things that your church has gone through, the Methodist church is going through right now, it's just a matter of time for my denomination. But some of these other, like Baptist, independent church, man, we got a ways to go. So thank you for bringing that up. So that shows, you know, we have a lot of work to do on race, but man, we've got a lot of work to do on so many other things in our society. And that's why I think, like, if Christians can come together and on race, maybe we can start modeling how to address these other systemic issues. Again, because I believe we're one of the few places where we have people from all walks of life coming together in a space. And we're bound by something else, right? We're bound by theology. Go ahead.
Sorry, I interrupted.
No.
So you mentioned something about not wanting to leave your African-American worship experience. So the Lutheran Church is not white, it's actually German and Scandinavian. So it's super white in its own way, right? And so there's this tension of that tradition really comes out of those. I mean, we've expanded it a little, but the odds, so I'm curious from if the worship service itself does not appeal to certain demographics, generally speaking, does that mean it's unwelcoming? And so, do you get the question?
Yeah.
So, like, we have people love people love our tradition, for good or bad. Mm-hmm. But we also realize, like, oh, this really doesn't appeal. Like, if you like an African American worship experience, it is likely. I mean, I've been to church with you. It's a different experience than when you come to, like, if the Holy Spirit came to a Lutheran church, we tell them to sit down and be quiet.
That's amazing.
And it's a bit of an exaggeration perhaps, but it's a good joke.
Yeah.
So that's the thing, no, because we're like, I'm sure our congregation is struggling with that. Mm-hmm. And so how do we change? So my concern is not just for us, but it's the old thing with, if we just put a coffee shop in, the millennials will come to church. You know, if we just do a few different hymns and people of color can be interested in our church, and it's like, I don't see it, man. But I'm looking at, and again, I can't expect you to speak for everybody. I'm just curious for your perspective.
Well, no, so I can tell you that there are some churches that are experimenting. So there are churches that will have 3 different services. So they'll have a contemporary worship service early, then they'll have their traditional service, and then usually later on they have kind of like almost an immigrant international service where you've got people from all parts of the world plugging into that. Now, sometimes they're usually of the same ethnicity, but I've been seeing that 3-tiered approach. And I've been really fascinated by that. So I've been asking these pastors how it's going, and they said, you know, it's coming along slowly. We can't say it's gangbusters, but
is there cross-pollination between the services?
No, not really. So usually people are just coming for one thing.
Yeah. So
now,
we want to.
Where you get the cross-pollination, though, is when the church has some kind of social function outside of that, because people still feel like they're part of that church, but they're just not going to go to that other worship service. So, you know, a lot of people are experimenting and figuring it out. Now, this is pre-pandemic. Now, I have to tell you, I don't know about your church, but I go to a small church, and I would call my church a dying church, you know, same demographic, no, very old. Like I'm 51 and people call me young man, and they should, because they're 80 and 90, right? Um, but since the pandemic, when we've gone to this virtual approach, we actually have more people going to our church now, in this virtual format. So it's going to be interesting once we get to the other side of this pandemic. It's going to be interesting. And, you know, 2 months ago, I really was worried about churches. I thought by this point I would hear about a bunch of churches just closing down, and that has not really happened. So it's been interesting.
JP, you got something?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Adrian. I'm JP.
Hey.
What are the kinds of things that your church is going through? Is it safe to say it's the same kind of thing that aging white churches are going through?
Absolutely. So very few young people are coming. And part of it is because of my church's stance on gay rights. But a lot of it is just the worship style just feels old. And a lot of this is dependent on who you have as a preacher. Because in my faith tradition, we don't get to pick our pastor. So basically somebody else decides who's going to be at my church, and they're on a 1 year. Yeah. So, you know, if you get a string of pastors that just aren't a good fit, man, people leave, and once they leave, they just don't really come back. Yeah. But in general, the trend is that just people aren't going to church as much as they used to. In fact, Colorado is, despite our reputation, because of what goes on in Colorado Springs, everybody's surprised when I tell them this. But when they have those listings of most non-religious places, Colorado is usually top 5. So we're fighting some serious headwinds here. But yeah, my church is facing the same kind of challenges that a white church faces.
Robin, do you have a question?
Yeah, I did. Well, I'm trying to think. It's less of a.
Most of the people I know are in that role, and you're right. It's rough being the broker. So now, what I hear about Denver, and I'd be curious. Did you grow up here? I'm just curious.
Outside of Denver, like
Okay.
in an area, yeah.
Okay. Well, so what people who move here, Black people who move here from other places, what they tell me is that they feel Denver's cliquish. It's Black community. They feel it's hard to plug in. And I think now more so than it was maybe 30 years, the Black community is more diffused now, because our traditional Black neighborhood is gentrifying. It's like a third white, third Latino, a third Black. So people are kind of moving all over the place. So I think there's a sense that it's hard to plug in once you get to Denver. Now, as somebody who grew up here, I went away for a long time, but when I came back, I could plug into those existing structures because I knew how to navigate them. And so it was easy for me. But yeah, most of the people I know are living a lonely existence because they're in predominantly white spaces. And now they're feeling pressure, right? Because the moment is calling for racial justice, and some are being held to account. If you're in this predominantly white space and you haven't pushed that institution to be more active on racial justice, it seems like you're somehow slacking on what you're supposed to be doing. I don't know if that's fair or not, but that's a narrative that I'm seeing emerge more and more now. So it's fairly interesting. But yeah, that's the experience of most people I know.
Kathleen, did you have a question?
Yeah, I work full-time at Central Presbyterian Church in downtown Denver, and we recently did what I think is the most bare minimum thing to do, which is to put up a Black Lives Matter sign. And I don't know why I've been shocked, but just the amount of people that are upset by this, who say it's too political, it's inappropriate, who just have all these wild ideas about the organization, all this stuff. And I wake up some mornings and I'm like, we need to bring everyone along. If they don't understand, we'll explain it. And then other times I'm like, you know, screw it, we're leaving you behind. Goodbye. Like, I don't, and I just don't, so I guess my question is, like, I just don't know how to approach it for my own just like well-being, but then just for the church as a larger organization.
Yeah, no, that's the question. I mean, you know, there's some churches that just put Black Lives Matter on the marquee, and the marquee is routinely vandalized. what I have seen that's been successful is there are some churches that are actually starting anti-racist groups, anti-racism kind of training and stuff within their congregation. And they're not calling it that. They're coming up with names that are more inviting, but that's basically what they're doing. And, one thing I've been thinking about from the Council of Churches is getting together the denominational heads, like, Bishop Ganya and others, and just see what they're doing in their congregations. And I think we got to figure out as the Council of Churches, how can we create like a compilation of best practices and resources so that we can start reaching out to churches, because I'm finding there are a lot of people in the pews that want to do something, and sometimes they have to bring the pastor along. But I think if we can find some churches that are doing this well and just share those best practices, I think that's the way to go forward. Because there's just a lot of people in churches like the people at your church, right? That just don't want to hear that or don't even want to see that. And I've been noodling on the same thing. It's like, okay, how do we engage those people? Because, we don't want anybody to leave our church. That's part of our sacred community. They've been a part of that. We hope that we can bring them along. And then we have to realize some people we're just not going to get. But, we don't want to alienate people. But at the same time, I just don't see how we can make progress unless we start to really push the envelope. And to your point, right, that may mean that people have to leave. Maybe it's time for them to go. And I've gone through that with my own church on issues of gay rights, because we've had some programming and other things that people just didn't want to deal with, and so they no longer come to my church. And that's painful because I miss seeing those people because I love them. They're part of my church. I know, I'm sorry I can't give you a great answer to that question, but that's because I haven't figured it out myself.
Adrian, one of the things, something you did that was really interesting before we started this chat was that you said you're going to assume positive intent and goodwill. And I think, if I can speak up on behalf of all white people for a moment, I think there are two major fears that when we start talking about race. One, we're going to say something so incredibly stupid and we're going to be embarrassed or ashamed. Or two, worse, we're going to blurt out something we didn't know was racist and is racist. And there's no coming, when someone accuses you of racism, you are just done. And so that was really curious. Like, I think that grace you gave was an amazing place to start. Because I do think there's this fear, like am I a closet racist? Well, if we don't talk about it, you're never going to find out, right?
Yep. Yeah, and I know that fear is palpable. That's why I've been saying lately that I think a real breakthrough is going to happen when we have all white spaces talking about race, because I think the presence of a person of color it alters the conversation. I don't think people really say what they're thinking or what's on their heart for those very reasons. And so I think if in my dialogue idea, if you don't put the pressure on the people of color to lead the discussion throughout, I think that changes the dynamic in significant ways. Because first of all, there's a lot of people of color that are tired of having to teach people. But I think if we can just move the center of gravity to people outside that community saying, okay, we've heard what was said. These are the things that I grew up hearing. This is what's a part of me. How do I work on this? I don't know how to do it, but I want to try. We have to start asking those questions and starting together, reach for answers and do this together. And again, it's going to be messy. It's going to be very messy, but I think there's possibility here.
Eric, thanks for your note. Understand you have to take off. Glad you enjoyed it. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you. Oh, hey, Eric. Good to see you.
Hey, good to see you too.
Who else has a question or a comment or a thought they'd like to share? Lori.
Yeah, hey, Adrian. It's good to have you here. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, where do you find the strength and the hope to keep doing this work? What are the kind of practical, concrete things that keep you going?
Yeah, so I try to have a daily reflection. that's spiritually guided. So finding hope in the Word, just looking at the example. And one example is just the life of Jesus. And one thing a pastor told me that made really resonated with me is that in the Bible, whenever there's a tough discussion, Jesus is never the one who leaves or ends the discussion. Jesus stays with that person, asks questions, provokes, but it's always the other person who leaves. And so I'm thinking like that's what I've got to model. I cannot be the one to write somebody off and leave. I'm supposed to stay with it and be there. So that, and then just eating a lot of soul food and barbecue, that sustains me. So, that's the regimen I figured out so far. But I'm not going to lie, I get drained. And so I need to recharge my batteries because it is draining work, because especially when to see Christians being racist, it's just sucks the life out of me.
Well, thank you.
We've got about 4 minutes left. Anybody else want to? So I'll share one more if no one else does. So
I have one after you, Steve.
Oh, great. Go ahead, Ray.
Oh, no, I was just going to ask Adrian, one of the challenges right now, of course, is coronavirus and the fact that we're not actually meeting and having meals together. And yet there's this energy, at least in our congregation, there's a new energy among white people in our congregation to engage this. And so we're trying to do these things, but the energy level it's just harder to sustain because everything's on Zoom, This has been a lovely conversation, but I'm just imagining what it would be like if we were actually with you in the room, Yeah. And so I'm just thinking like ahead to and of course you don't have a crystal ball, but I'm just wondering what you've seen through the Colorado Council of Churches maybe, or something about how to kind of begin where we're at, even though it's not ideal.
Yeah. So one thing is, the big question mark is when we will be able to gather in person. But when we're able to do that, I think there's going to be a real hunger for this relationship building. But one thing that's happening is just basically pastors are now reaching out to me and saying they want to partner with the Black church. And so I think what's going to be happening in the coming months is I'm going to be facilitating discussions between a Black pastor and a white pastor, where they're going to talk about this, like the challenges. And I'm hoping to have a series of these. And I'm hoping that the pastors that I talk to will form relationships with their church. So that's what I see coming. So right now, I only see one of those happening, but I'm hoping that at least 2 or 3 more can happen. We've got a challenging few months ahead, the election, and then it's holiday season. And so, but personally, I just don't think we're going to be gathering until 2021. And so that really complicates all of this stuff, especially the welcome table idea, which is predicated on sitting down and having a meal, which, by the way, that's our heritage, right? The early church was about meals in someone's home and then sharing the good news, right?
So. Well, it gives us something to look forward to, at least, if we can start to lay the groundwork and share in our community that not only will we be gathering as we were before in the sense of the community that has held on throughout the pandemic, but we're going to be building these new relationships across race and across congregations. I think that's exciting. It's another thing to look forward to. I know that it's something I'm really excited because we've talked about in housekeeping, our council, about doing this, and we've started to reach out a little bit, but we didn't know how to actually facilitate that. So it's awesome to know that that's something that you're working on, and we can work with you on that. So we'll be hitting you up.
All right,
Michelle,
that sounds good.
Michelle, did you have something? I saw you came off mute.
No, I was just thinking the same thing, that I'm kind of wondering if there's some way we can start pairing together with other churches, even if they are little Zoom gatherings, or meet in the park and picnic together, or so I'm really excited about it too.
Cool. I like that. I like the energy.
So Adrian, I want to, on behalf of House, thanks for saying yes to doing tonight. Thanks to Lori for for doing the work to get us together, and Kathleen, thanks for keeping us going. It was really informative and interesting, and I'm sure we could talk for another few hours, but I want to honor that we said 8 o'clock, and it's now 8 o'clock. So
All
thanks
right.
for being
Well,
here and
blessings
joining us.
to
It
all
was
of
a
you.
great conversation. Yeah. Do you have a way to, if someone's interested in following this Soul Food Scholar, I think now would be a great time to plug yourself.
All right, that's not my inclination, but yes, I will do that. So I am really active on social media. So Soul Food Scholar is the way to find me. So on Instagram and Twitter, it's @Soul Food Scholar. My website is soulfoodscholar.com. I also have a Soul Food Scholar fan page on Facebook. And my tagline is dropping knowledge like hot biscuits, as Steve mentioned earlier. So I'm all about sharing informative and entertaining stories about food as a way to bring us together.
And if you haven't had a chance to read that article that was posted, you really should take a minute to. It's really good. It's really worth your time.
Where was that posted?
I think Reagan, you posted it in the Half-Ass page, yeah.
Yes.
There's a link in the last newsletter too.
Yeah, it's really good. Okay, thanks for everybody, and have
Thank
a
you.
great evening.
Wonderful. We will be in touch really soon.